we're going to go ahead and get started. Because we have a limited amount of time for every set of presenters, I am just going to introduce the topic and the presenters very quickly. So first up, we have Let's Talk About E-Waste, How Can LIS Pedagogy Engage This Difficult Problem by Jimi Jones and Karin Hodgin Jones. Thanks. Oh, also, they will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of questions. So for you guys, I'm going to have signs indicating when you're running out of time. Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm Karin Hodgin Jones. I'm from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I'm working on my Master's of Urban Planning. And I'm going to kind of introduce the idea of e-waste and a little bit about why it's an issue in urban planning and why I'm hoping it'll become a bigger issue in libraries. So generally, very basically, what is e-waste? Well, it's everything that's associated with electronics. All these cables, wires, connections, computer monitors actually fall under multiple classes of toxic and hazardous waste, but can generally be considered e-waste. Motherboards and circuit boards, of course, have a lot of complex components, that some of which are toxic, some of which are highly valuable. Drives, cables, and disks, as well as pretty much everything that's going to be a part of the Internet of Things. So if we want to have everything connected, it will be connected by complex equipment that includes toxic and valuable materials. And so for that reason, the conversation starter is now about what will be a really big potential crisis or a really big opportunity in the 21st century for dealing responsibly with our technology. Okay, so some of the things that are in e-waste, beryllium, cadmium, chromium hexavalent. If anyone saw the Aaron Brockovich movie, then you know that the central issue for the cancer cluster in that film was about chromium hexavalent exposure. Lead, which obviously we know a little bit about, causing birth defects and difficulties with development of the brain. Nickel, mercury. And then you get into some of the items that are quite valuable: copper, gold, palladium, silver, aluminum less so, cobalt, tin, and a number of plastics that are reusable and recyclable, but also when burned can become quite toxic. So, why is e-waste important? E-waste has been identified by the US EPA, United Nations, and other organizations as being the fastest growing waste stream of the 21st century. There are very few regulations on what wealthy nations must do to manage e-waste and to be good stewards of e-waste. And there are few to none, few to no regulations in many poorer nations. The EPA and other agencies that are responsible for managing e-waste don't have universal methodologies for identifying how much waste is out there, how much waste we're making, how much waste needs to be managed, and therefore they don't have a really clear idea necessarily of what capacity we need to build for recycling. In the past 15 years in the United States, only 25 states have passed laws that govern e-waste disposal and recycling, and very few have locally serviceable domestic or adequate facilities. And it's going to take quite a bit of time to build these facilities and just to manage the backlog of existing waste that's awaiting disposal, let alone the increasingly rapidly produced new amount of waste that's coming into the waste streams. So, where does e-waste go? It goes all over the place, and we'll look at a map in just a second about where it's headed. So maintaining regulatory compliance with environmental and toxic waste handling policies in wealthy nations is obviously costly. If you have excellent regulations and you have excellent enforcement, that means that you have fines and you have responsibility and accountability. Unfortunately, because of the discrepancy between the levels of regulation in different nations, it's very feasible to just move this problem into an area where it's not legally a problem. So since e-waste recycling can at times be prohibitively expensive or infeasible or unapproachable or even unknowable, say for an institution, how it is that they can responsibly relocate what will become electronic waste if not properly managed, if they don't know where to send it, it becomes infeasible for them to be responsible recyclers. So in many cases, materials are exported to countries that have less strict or no regulatory restrictions at all or safety protocols for handling e-waste. And the result of this is a major social justice issue, right? That the e-waste is being processed in very unsafe environments. There's a lot of harmful pollutant release into bodies, atmosphere, and soil and water. And you frequently have the use of child labor in these spaces as well. So I apologize for the formatting on this slide. According to the U.S. International Trade Commission, $1.45 billion worth of used electronic products were exported to other nations in 2011. So this is the primary method through which we recycle e-waste often. And unfortunately, you can often find in poorer nations a number of objects with university ID stamps. They clearly went through all of the right protocols. They moved through the system to the surplus. They moved from the surplus into regional recycling programs. And then they wound up in Ghana, or they wound up in Lagos, Nigeria, or perhaps in Pakistan or China. And they went there because they were designated as being functional. However, the reality is that 43% of the 324,000 tons of UEPs that were exported were non-functional at the point that they were exported in 2011. And also in programs designed to export computer technologies for use in developing nations, it's frequently the case that a very small proportion of it is reported as being non-functional at the point of exportation, but it arrives and is inventoried as clearly non-functional. So say a shipment moves into Agbogbloshie, Accra, Ghana, and at the point that it was shipped out of EU or it was shipped from the United States, it was claimed that less than 1% of it was non-functional and would go immediately into recycling, but in fact 12 to say 30% of it was non-functional when it arrived. And so the lack of kind of clear policy, clear oversight, and clear movement of this material leads to a lot of both confusion and opportunity for really unhealthy handling of the waste. So take a look at where it goes. In this case, you can see some of the directions in which waste is moving out of the United States. And again, this typically happens through what appear to be very above board and very sound management policies. The university here, Jimi has told me, though I haven't seen them, has a large cage at the bottom of the library that's filled with decades worth of computers. I was recently at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, and they have near their director's office about I think 25 years worth of every computing technology that they've ever used stacked there. And it's really interesting to see that, but it's outside, and so it's being rained on, and so it's being damaged by, say, monkeys and cows. It's maybe a little bit of a joke, but in fact, there are a lot of animals that are engaging with it, taking it apart, and distributing what could be toxic materials around the location. So here are some of the places that e-waste goes. Sweden is in gold, in part, in my mind, because it has the gold standard. It's one of the locations where we ship microchips to be smelted to recapture gold. However, the areas in the South Pacific where we ship, many of those are transfer points at which items that are leaving the United States responsibly may be repackaged and sent to places where they in fact shouldn't be sent and shouldn't be reprocessed. And so this is a concern because obviously these are unsafe conditions in which children and women and informal workers are engaging with these materials that are toxic, and the ways that they engage with them, because we have very costly regulatory restrictions in the United States, which is not an argument against building better capacity, but is an argument for different approaches to managing those costs. Because it's very inexpensive to handle things badly. We ship them abroad. So in this case, this gentleman is burning rubber shielding off of copper wire, and so that results in a considerable amount of dioxin release and obviously atmospheric and soil deposition of those materials. And of course, we have to think also about the exploitation that's happening at the front end with the labor that goes into producing the electronics. So before I hand this off to Jimi, I want to talk about why I'm coming at this as a planning issue. It's not a novel approach to address practitioners as the method by which we might mitigate a social ill. However, I think that it is something that could be used a lot more in urban planning, that we would go to, for example, all of the future practitioners in this space who will be doing things like building digital repositories, who will be making choices about, for example, your file formats for digitized collections, how many times you wish to produce redundant elements in your collections. All of these things impact our demand for what will ultimately become a waste stream. So this is where our conversation began, and now I'd like to hand it off to Jimmy to kind of further elaborate on that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jimmy Jones, and I'm happy to be here. It's nice to see everybody. I'm a doctoral student here at GISLIS, and now that Karin sketched out kind of the broad problem, I want to talk a little bit about memory institutions in electronic waste and LIS pedagogy. So in the world of libraries, archives, and museums, as we've moved into the digital area and with the growth of digital libraries and repositories and the digital humanities, we're producing much more digital content. And digital objects, which, and this is, I think this first bullet's an easy thing to forget sometimes, but digital objects have a materiality. They have to live somewhere. They have to live on some substrate, some kind of physical thing, and something's going to happen with that physical thing over time. I think that the growth of cloud storage, this idea that the bits don't live locally, but they're up in the cloud, confuses the issue for some people a little bit. But the digital stuff that we create has to go somewhere, and even cloud storage, of course, it's sitting on some kind of a server. Digital audiovisual materials have really large file sizes, and I think with growth of, again, the digital humanities, things like YouTube, high-speed internet access, which we've had growing for 10 years, mobile devices and accessing AV materials, means that we're doing a lot more digitization of AV stuff, and that's really where a lot of stuff, a lot of size gets eaten up in our storage. And so what I'm proposing here in this last bullet is more conversation about what I'm calling smart size digitization, or digitization that's that considers not just the outputs, the ultimate standards for what we're producing on the back end, but the inputs, and creating things that are proportional in size. But before I talk about that, I want to mention that digitization is a very technologically intensive process, especially in the AV realm. Here you see a technology stack devoted to digitizing analog video, and there's a lot of gear here. Archives and libraries, when they do digitization, they tend to be loath to get rid of this stuff because who knows when we're going to have more tapes to digitize. But at some point, we're going to have to do something with this gear. So it's not just the ones and zeros and where we're going to store them at the end, but we also, in time, will have to think about all of this infrastructure that we've built to create the ones and zeros. At some point, they're going to have to go somewhere, too. File formats. So Karin mentioned that file formats in digitization, what we call target formats, what we're digitizing to, there's a wealth of formats we can choose. Nowhere is that more true than, in the video realm. And we can make any number of choices devoted to sizes. The conversation around digitization tends to be that we should always digitize at the highest possible quality, and that has obvious merit for the historical record. It's really important to digitize things to the best of our abilities. It's how we responsibly steward information forward into the digital era. However, thinking about inputs and what we buy when we digitize at high levels of quality, I think is really important. And this is something that I talk about in my classes. I think a good lesson here, this little calculator that I found online for inputs and outputs and what file sizes you generate, I think makes a lot of illustrative sense. So here we have, say, a VHS tape, and we have any number of ways that we can digitize it. If we digitize it at what we call DV, or the digital video codec, which is for, I would argue, for a lot of applications, perfectly adequate digitization. For an hour of content, we get 11 gigabytes. If we follow what is kind of common wisdom and we digitize at the highest possible quality, in this case, uncompressed video, we're left with a file, same video content, that is 10 times as big, a little over 10 times as big. And the question that I pose is this really buying us anything? We're digitizing something at a very high level of quality. We're taking up a lot of space, which means that our potential electronic waste footprint goes up. But we're writing a lot of empty data. So is this always the right conversation to have? Can we have a little more nuance to our conversation about the stuff that we're creating on the back end? Fortunately, I'm not the first person who's thought of this. This is a slide that I cribbed from a friend of mine at WGBH in Boston. And this is a breakdown of what the inputs that they have, the analog, mostly analog, at least the top half, is analog inputs and what the digital outputs are. And you can see that they've followed something really similar. In fact, I was influenced by them and by some work that's done at the BBC as well. For VHS, for some of these kind of lower quality consumer formats, they agree. Now they're being motivated by, not necessarily by their electronic waste footprint, they're being motivated by a very parallel impulse, which is cost. We don't want to have to buy a lot of servers. We don't want to have to buy a lot of storage, which is perfectly valid. You know, we're working in service of the same goal, right? Not buying, not producing, and then not ultimately having to dispose of very much gear. And what they've decided is this is perfectly adequate. Digitizing at a low level of quality is fine for something that has a low level of quality coming into it. There's no reason to make a huge kind of Cadillac tier digitization policy for something that's really not that high quality to begin with. But there are challenges to it. Common wisdom, of course, is to go for the golden digitization. Engineers, if I ever bring this up, and I brought this up before in meetings that involved engineers, and I see that their eyes start to kind of cross because they're thinking of the highest possible quality all the time. An admirable impulse, right? However, like I said before, it could balloon up your storage infrastructure and contribute to waste and contribute to cost. Two things that we like to think about, or at least one of them in terms of cost that we think about all the time in the memory institutions. So there's a little pushback there. Formats and encoding sustainability, what do we choose and why do we choose it and how long is it going to be sustainable into the long term? There's a lot of arguments for something like uncompressed, which is what I showed a couple slides back as being very sustainable, whereas DV may not be as much. So time will tell about that, but there's a very real issue that complicates this. Balancing long-term sustainability against near-term and long-term exploitation and environmental damage, stuff that Karin was talking about. You know, where are our priorities? Is our priority to preserve grandma's 90th birthday at a huge level of quality forever and ever? Or can we think about, well, you know, if it's my grandma, right? But can we think about, you know, what's our big picture mandate? What are we preserving? Because we have the ability to preserve not just information, but potentially be a part of preserving our environment, right? So there's a little back and forth there. And the last bullet's a little bit technical. I don't want to get into a video digitization seminar. You can take my class for that. Broadcast video, and I should say this, broadcast video is more information than just pictures. So there's all kinds of other information that can be harvested, and some of these kind of lesser codecs, DV and so forth, may not capture this stuff. So the upshot of this is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it could be a part of the conversation that will help us save money, which is important, and perhaps contribute to saving the environment or preserving the environment. So what's going on here at GISLIS? There are a couple of doctoral students who are working on, I think they've disseminated a waste policy survey. I think they've been sending it out to university libraries and archives. Basically saying, do you have any policies in place for just getting rid of your stuff? Do you know where it goes? Do you know what to do with it? Do you know what to do with a hard drive as opposed to tape storage, as opposed to an old VCR or computer monitor, et cetera? I don't know what the results of that are yet. At least one of those grad students, in fact, I think maybe both of them, are working on a component lecture that they want to add to our LIS 502 class in the coming years. That's a class that all master's students have to take. It's a survey course. And I think if all of you have already taken it, you're going to miss out on that. But incoming students, anyway, will get some dialogue about this stuff. Then there's a class that I'm teaching next year. I'm hoping that it will be a hands-on AV digitization class, and I intend to bring this concept of input-related digitization or smart-sizing digitization into the conversation. This is very important to me. And then Karin and I and some other LIS teachers, students, and practitioners are working on a couple of proposals for conferences this year. We haven't gotten out yet. We don't know if we'll be accepted, but we're going to try. One of them at the AMIA meeting at the end of the year. That's the Association of Moving Image Archivists. And the ASIST, what does that stand for? Association for Information Science and Technology. I never remember that. Which will be in St. Louis in November, I think. So we're going to expand this conversation and bring more people into it. And I think that's where we landed on that. So let's take some questions. Yeah.
So when you have a question, please make sure to introduce yourself for our online students.
Hi, I'm Kelly Try. I'm the biosciences librarian here. I wanted to know what you guys thought about the implications of big data, open data, and the repository push, and the sometimes seemingly inconsiderations as to whether or not we should be saving all data, whether or not all data is necessary to be saved in the way that you were talking about file formats, if you could speak to that.
Oh boy, not being a big data expert, I'm loath to say that not all data should be saved. Can I tweet that you said that not all data? Tweet that right now. I don't see any reason why there can't be something kind of similar to what I described for video, for data. Again, not being an expert. I think one of the things that's really nice about the moment we're in and the communication we have with other repositories is that perhaps we can minimize the duplication of data. I know that good digital preservation means there needs to be some. I mean, lots of copies keep stuff safe, right? But at the same time, if we're not unnecessarily replicating data, then we're not taking up as much space. Did you want to say?
In the realm of big data, that's, again, out of my field a little bit, but I do come from museums, and having worked as a collections manager and registrar, I mean, there are very few institutions such as that don't have a deaccession policy. And so I'm really curious in the LIS field and then in the museum field as well, where as we're moving into, for example, housing born digital objects, what the deaccession policy will be. If we think that the fact that we can store it electronically means that we have increased our storage capacity to infinity, that's a really different approach than the historic volumetric concerns of holding objects within an institution. And so I hope that those are also conversations that are developing within these fields.
Hi, I'm Sveta, master's student here at Gislis, and I was actually going to say, I think that it's really important that we sort of get this into the conversation now, because maybe the cost that lets this happen kind of by default, as sort of computing gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, that is like less of an issue. So I think as much as we can do to get this part of our conversation now, to sort of foreground sustainability, is great. And so have you guys had any luck in sort of speaking with people who are motivated primarily by how the cost is cheaper to do this, to sort of get them to think a little bit more broadly and big picture about it?
I think you have to talk about but can I just really quickly? I think that's just the way in, honestly, because the reality is the hardest thing that people are going to do on a day-to-day basis as practitioners is manage and justify their budgets. And so as far as getting people interested in it, we're just starting to have this conversation as with us kind of leading this part of it. But yes, that seems to be the thing to which people respond most clearly, most readily, because that's a constant work-life pressure. And so we hope to approach it from being able to alleviate that, but also obviously the aspects of social justice and environmental justice are part and parcel with it. So.
Yeah, and I think having worked in archives, I know that, Jimi Jones, lone arranger, underfunded archivist, is already thinking about the bottom line. So, coming at it from a place of, you can be both helping your bottom line and doing something really smart for the world, gold star, is a much better motivator than like, you should be ashamed of this, like that kind of thing. That I just think shame's a bad motivator anyway. But yeah, I think that's kind of our way into the conversation. This is just yet another reason why you should consider this. And for me, being an AV person, for the past 10, 15 years in AV digitization, it's been all about platinum level. You should be doing what the Library of Congress is doing. You should be doing what this, you should be doing what the National Archives are doing. You should be doing this. Da, 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 da. It's left a lot of people kind of adrift because it's like, I know I'm never going to be able to do that. And it's like, well, actually, this is a very compelling argument for not doing that sometimes, for consciously not doing that. And there's other shops like WGBH, I presume well-funded, but have a lot of stuff, and they're doing that. They're motivated by the bottom line. But I think this conversation gives you a little kind of moral, it introduces, I think, in a very positive way, in a very real way, kind of a moral component to it. It's not just because I can't afford a JPEG 2000 encoder. It's because, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to take up that. I don't want this stuff to land somewhere in India and people are poisoned by it. Obviously we're all contributing to it all the time, but maybe I can put the brakes on a little bit.
I want to read comments from online really fast.
Sure.
So Martin is saying, making a decision about what kind of data must be preserved means a huge responsibility, and redundancy is also an important factor. Maybe the collaboration among cultural heritage institutions in the field of digital preservation can be a solution, but I am afraid usually we cannot say no for preservation needs. The question is how and where to do it in a sustainable way. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, that's good.
Hi, I'm Madison Sullivan. I'm a master's student here at GISLIS as well. And I was wondering if you saw, is there really that much of a difference between how we think about this stuff in the physical environment and then in the electronic or like digital preservation environment? To me, it seems like the issues are still kind of the same. Like how we have collection development policies, or these are the things that we will accession or not accession. Like maybe hopefully we'll be seeing, here's our digital preservation policy, here's our e-waste policy, or I feel like it's kind of, hopefully maybe we can take some of the same steps we've made in preserving physical collections in the same way that we would preserve our electronic collections. And maybe that might be an avenue into the conversation, like, well, we're doing this, these are the same concerns physically, so this is how we should be looking at this in an electronic environment as well.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely a way on. I think there's the cost-saving side, and I think there's the this actually kind of parallels what we're already doing with deaccessioning and so forth, and sending paper to be pulped. And we're already thinking this way, sending all of our magnetic tape that we don't want anymore to be responsibly broken down and so forth, because that's part of it too. That's a big part of waste.
Physically, like 1%.
Yes.
So we're already not preserving a vast majority of the things we could be.
Right.
So it's not surprising, that that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, I don't know what NARA's numbers are, but I know it's in the single digits, and that's common for most archives. We don't keep that much stuff.
I think that there's kind of a mad dash right now, and it seems like in speaking with people who are working with digital preservation within the library field, and certainly in my own museum where where I was before I came back to get another graduate degree, that we were kind of like, oh, what do we do? We're going to get born digital. It's children's book art, and so we were going to start getting born digital children's book art, and we needed to have protocols in place to safely care for these objects. And so it was like, okay, well, we just need a consultant. Who can tell us what to do? Is there a manual? Is there a book? Who can we ask? And even though we were very close to the 5-college consortium in Western Massachusetts, we still didn't really have a clear pathway into how do I approach this question. You have so many small institutions making these decisions without any information really, or clear information. And so yeah, they know, okay, we can say no to a potential gift, or we can in 5 years make a plan for what will be moved out of our collection, maybe into collections where it would be more meaningfully situated. We can make those choices, but the question question of like, how do we deal with the digital in these small shops that aren't run by people who have this expertise? It's just a panic to make sure they have a backup server or something. And so I'm hoping to bring this into the College Art Association conference and some other spaces where I will try to go. And spaces where I think the museum professionals might get a little aha moment as well of there's support out there and it may just be in a different discipline, and let's bring this conversation into the bigger space. But the ethical underpinnings, which I loved that the keynote speaker spoke about earlier in these fields, make this a really approachable field, a really approachable community to begin to ask these questions. And what's more, because library information scientists are people who will disseminate the kind of ethics and their values into communities, it's a wonderful place to begin to expand that conversation into larger communities. I'm not approaching businesses, not with these questions. I'm approaching businesses who are making electronic devices and asking them to incorporate into the upfront cost of production the cost of waste management. That's the policy position I could take with a corporate entity, but with a group like this of future practitioners, you can actually change the world, and you can create a greater pressure on those institutions than I can.
Great. Thank you to Jimmy and Karin. Great.